their, the worship place, or they are not entitled to speak about their religion or their the preachings. So problems start here because in society, if we are starting judging others by the yardstick of our own beliefs, for example, if I have belief A and others have belief B or C, if I say my belief A is correct, and if I use the word the belief B is not correct, here is a problem which causes difference and which causes hatred against each other. Instead of that, if we can replace the process of these words, saying that believe I have a belief A, but my other counterpart has belief B. Both have our own beliefs, so we stick to our beliefs. So we cannot be judgmental saying that A is correct or B is correct or B is not correct or A is not correct. This thinking start at the local level. Even if at the broader macro level, you have a constitutional framework that provides you a clear-cut dimension and guidelines that all religions have equal opportunities in this country, right from Article 20, 21, 22, 25, 27, all talk about equality in religion and belief. This is a macro level framework which provides that equal citizenship right, even Article 25. And even Article 25 subsection, which talks about section C, which talks about giving even special rights to those who are disadvantaged in a sense. They have quoted here women and children. But similarly here, people from other religion, they also are marginalized. So people, those who are at the margin, they have the right in the constitution that for their uplift, there is a need to have some more legislation that at a broader level can give them protection. This is a macro level framework that provides this protection. That is that protection can actually give a sense in society that no one can be discriminated on the basis of belief or religion. And if that message goes down to the local level and it is built in the local frameworks, I will talk about that, what could be the local framework. Then in the local framework, if things are embedded the way it is embedded in the macro level in the constitution, and at local level, those who are the implementer of the law and constitution, if that is embedded at local level, whether through the local government, since there are not, now the local governments are non-existent in the country, but ultimately they will come up, that can also be helpful. And in their place, there is a district and local level administration. They should also embed in their frameworks that they should not discriminate anyone on the basis of religion. If this sort of discrimination, judgmental attitude, we and they attitude are removed from our dictionary, then certainly communities will be more resilient against violent extremism, because violence would not generate when there is no hatred. So hatred started from we and they kind of conceptualization. So this is one thing. Now, with this, from macro to micro level frameworking, which is from national level to the local level. In local level framework, if we have active participation of the citizen at local level in such debates, then certainly there could be a change. Here, I would like to quote my experience of working in South Punjab, particularly in the union, in the villages and union council level in Multan, where it was considered that South Punjab is probably the, it was considered earlier probably the center of violent extremism. That has been quoted in various studies. But when we started working in these areas, we analyzed where to start with. So our analysis was that in the absence of the local framework, we have to unite the communities on this issue. on the CVE issue, countering violent extremism issues. Then we started we picked up 12, 11, 12 union council in Multan, which were more rural, because in urban setting there is these kind of hatred, but still, people uh, feel differently. But in villages, these kind of hatred sometimes end up with a violence, a local level violence. So we picked up these union councils, wherein in each union council there were many villages. We set up there the citizen peace committees on countering violent extremism, and we picked up the local mosque imams and the leadership of the mosque who organized the fairs of the mosque, and picked people, notable people from the villages, from all faiths. Whether, if there are some areas where non-Muslim were also there, but we picked the areas where Muslim with different sects were there, and they were not even on the talking term. There were some villages where they were not on the talking term, because one village was majority of the one village belongs to one sect, the other village had the other sect, and these sectarian differences were causing sort of violence in these areas. So when we picked up and we took all the CPC members, 7-member citizen peace committee at union council level, we brought them to the provincial headquarters in Lahore, and organize a 3 days training for them, how to think that difference is not a bad thing. Difference or diversity is beauty, but they were trained that they would not use this diversity of belief and religion as hatred, but they will, take it as acceptance at the first level, that they have to accept that those who have different beliefs and religion out of their belief and religion, they are equal citizen of Pakistan, and they should not be mistreated, badly treated, or undermined, or discriminated. So these kind of training were given. And on a lighter note, I would like to share one of my dialogue with two religious scholars. One was from the Muslim, you know, from Islam, and one was from Christian. At After a second day of training, at third day, we were at a breakfast table. These two religious scholars, one from a Muslim sect and the other from a Christian, I was sitting with them to take their feedback out of the 2 days training. The Maulana Sahab, who was from a Muslim sect, uh, you know, asked me, Dr. Sahab, the last night we could not sleep. And by the way, I forgot to tell you, first day we tried to have a kind of a discussion, and then from second night we put the different people together in the single room. For example, the Christian priest was there, and the religious scholar from a Muslim thought was there. So they both, those who were talking to me at the breakfast, they were put in a room, in the same room. So he said, we could not sleep whole night. First, I was afraid. What happened? I said, Maulana Sahab, what happened? Are you okay? There's nothing. Oh, no worry about that. But we have been talking, we have been discussing a lot based on the 2 days discussion. So we found that there are a lot of similarities in both religion. And then next sentence of the Maulana Sahib was, but some of the beliefs of Christians are not correct. Here I stopped him. Maulana, during 2 days, we have been discussing that we cannot judge whether one belief is correct or not correct, but you can say it's different. Then he refined, yes, you are right. You said this, and I want to say this, that but some are different views and different beliefs there. So in that way, we started this kind of work. And believe me, after more than 2 years work there in these areas, now the Christian priest attends the Eid Miladun Nabi celebrations, and I was myself there when there was a 25th December Christmas cake cutting in a church, not only a church but a pastoral institute, where more than 10 ulama from all sects all Muslim sects were there, and we were having a celebration of Christmas, and there was a cake cutting ceremony. Similarly, the delegation, we took these delegation of ulama to a local Hindu temple, which was in dilapidated position. When we all visited, there was the religious scholar who said, "Oh, this is really in a bad condition. Let us help this poor community to at least, make it worth worship place." So then there was a local contribution, and this, even in Multan, a very poorly conditioned temple, Hindu temple, was renovated a bit, not really lavishly, but with local fund. Then local fund generation was made to build a church, and the groundbreaking ceremony was done by various religious scholars from Muslim thought. And these pictures were, when published, there was a problem. Local level people say, "Oh, why you were there, Maulana Sahab? You were digging out the groundbreaking of the church." But they defended, and there was a controversy. But finally, the acceptance started. So what I mean to say is that if you have some real local level actions, and action through a structured way, like we have organized the CPCs, citizen peace committees, involving all people, and they were having their monthly meetings. So in monthly meeting, they have an interaction. If there were some community level conflict, they have resolved it then and there. If there was some sort of a religious shattered kind of thing, they started then and there. And one more question out of this, the point out of this work is that there was a big protest in Multan after Supreme Court decision of Asiya Bibi. But did you hear that any violence took place there? Though there were sentiments were huge. A lot of people, large crowds were there, but no violence took place. So because these religious scholars who were working in this localized project, they have been defending there, and they have been stopping people not to go to fire any place of worship of any other religion. So these kind of local level examples are there which can be embedded. And then at macro level, another thing came up. Pakistan has made a program, Pakistan, which carries this message of the Constitution of Pakistan, that all Pakistanis, whether they belong to any religion, have the equal rights. So their protection is our protection. With this, sort of programming, now the Pakistan, from macro level to micro level, now it has entered to a district level. Pakistan is being spread, or taken to the ground level people, and now these kind of activities are on. So these are the beginning of starting a local, developing a local framework. This conference and the outcome of this conference will also lead us to develop some of the points which we can send to the policy makers for developing such a local level framework, which hopefully my other colleagues in the conference will speak about. So thank you very much for your patient hearing to my thoughts. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Mustafa.
थैंक यू डॉक्टर शक्कर मरीर, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया. और यस, इट्स ट्रू कि डाइवर्सिटी इज द बिगेस्ट व्हाट वी कैन से द चैलेंज दैट वी हैव टू एक्सेप्ट एंड वी हैव टू डील विद. और एक जुमला है बहुत ही कॉमन कि लेट्स एग्री टू डिसएग्री. तो ये जो लेट्स एग्री टू डिसएग्री है, इसके ऊपर हमें जो है ज्यादा फोकस करना चाहिए. और मैं तो ये समझता हूँ कि गलत कोई भी नहीं होता. Everyone is right under his circumstances, under his parameters. But मसला क्या आता है, इट्स अ डिफरेंस ऑफ ओपिनियन. एंड डिफरेंस ऑफ ओपिनियन को जो है एक्सेप्ट मेरे ख्याल से करना चाहिए. एक जो हमारा माइंडसेट बन गया है कि अगर आप मेरी तरह सोचते हो, मेरे जैसे हो, मेरी तरह से आप समझते हो, तो यू आर माय फ्रेंड. और अगर आप मेरे तरह नहीं सोचते, मेरे जैसे नहीं है, तो आप मेरे दुश्मन हैं. तो यही कॉन्सेप्ट और यही बेसिकली ऑब्जेक्टिव है हमारा कि कुछ ऐसा फ्रेमवर्क बनाया जाए कि माशरे में एक जो जहन में ये चीज है कि इफ समवन इज डिफरेंट फ्रॉम मी, he is my enemy. No, he is not our enemy. He is different from us. This is the main thing, main objective. जो कि हम अचीव करने की कोशिश करेंगे। अदर देन दैट हम लोगों ने कॉन्फ्रेंस का काम सबसे शुरू किया, अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह वी हैव अ वेरी ह्यूज रीच। जो कॉन्फ्रेंस को हमने पेजेस बनाए हैं ओवर द सोशल मीडिया, 16,000 प्लस पीपल हैव व्यूड इट। अदर देन दैट राइट नाउ वी हैव सेवरल couple of 100 स्टूडेंट्स हु आर लिस्टिंग दिस कॉन्फ्रेंस। अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह ये फेसबुक पे भी इस वक्त लाइव जा रही है, और इधर लिंक में भी हमारे पास वी हैव मेनी स्टूडेंट्स फ्रॉम ऑल 3 यूनिवर्सिटीज ओवर हियर, एंड सब एकेडमिया के लोग भी मुझे नजर आ रहे हैं। आप सबका बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। फॉर फर्दर इसको आगे बढ़ाने के लिए मैं डॉक्टर नईम को बुलाना चाहूंगा, और ही विल गोइंग टू इंट्रोड्यूस योर फर्स्ट स्पीकर, और उसके बाद जो है हम पहले स्पीकर को सुनेंगे। बहुत शुक्रिया।
सर आवाज नहीं आ रही, काइंडली चेक कर लीजिए। आवाज नहीं आ रही, चेक कर लीजिए।
So we are now starting our formal session, and for this our first speaker is Mohammad Fayaz, who is the doctoral candidate uh, at the Queen's University, Belfast, UK. His research areas span multidisciplinary fields: peace and conflict studies, terrorism studies, strategy, political communication, and various research studying and theorizing political violence, specifically organizational dynamics and behaviors of terrorist groups and organizations from and in several mainstream journals of terrorism research. His most recent research article, Communication, Unsavviness, and the Failure of Terrorism, a case of Pakistani terrorist organizations, has been published by Dynamics of Asymmetric Conflict. So over to Fayaz Saab. So we are very much looking forward to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naeem. Am I audible? Just confirm.
जी सर, yes.
Thank you. And those of our colleagues who could not hear Dr. Naeem introducing me, my name is Fayaz, Muhammad Fayaz, and I am currently doing my PhD, and my focus area is longevity of terrorism, or a simple question that I'm trying to understand and investigate is why terrorism does not end. And I'm doing my PhD at the Queen's University, Belfast, United Kingdom. Dr. Naeem, please alert me when you want to stop me for leaving some time for the question and answer session. This is essentially an academic perspective or a presentation. And my overall epistemological approach, or what we can call worldview, is imbued with critical theory. Simply, it means that I approach social reality or political reality or the status quo with skepticism to locate the problem, with a spirit to find solution that emancipates communities, which is also consistent with the purpose of current conference. And I may also mention here that the sources of my insights, which comprise a very large and diverse, varied sample from Pakistan, is part of an ongoing research, as I just mentioned. And these sources include an in-depth interviews of militants from Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, from Balochistan Liberation Army, from Balochistan Republican Army, the interviews with ideologues and heads of sectarian organizations, and also using the original sources of YouTube-based self-recorded videos by the militants and by the so-called extremists, and also consulting Tehreek-e-Taliban's Pakistan's publications. I've also interviewed the higher civil military echelons and also nationally known leaders from the mainstream political parties, all political parties, and also members of civil society and heads of at least 3 provinces, counterterrorism departments, as well as a number of practitioners. And I have also had the privilege of interviewing experienced investigators who have the experience of interrogating as many as perhaps 100 and even more active political activists. And then I also have, for this particular conference, I also sought special or expert input from some of my colleagues in the terrorism studies, like Richard Jackson, who is the head of National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, New Zealand, and Alex Peter Smith, who is the proponent of definition of terrorism. No book is complete without allusion to his arguments. And then Brian Phillips, who is a professor in Essex University. I also sought assistance and was accorded so by a colleague, Dr. Zahid Shahab from Deakin University, Australia. And obviously I read a lot of academic and policy material, including archival literature, that is memoirs. First, I wish to share with you some various prevailing traditions or perspectives on what we are calling countering violent extremism, henceforth CV, followed by my own understanding of the topic. And this will mainly be a conceptual conversation and later a brief survey of the state of the knowledge and which way it is going. I synthesize from the available literature that there are 4 perspectives currently in vogue in the academic world and about the CV. And these perspectives, I have named them as one is the mainstream or the orthodoxy, the middling, and then a blend of CV and prevention of violent extremism, and lastly, a critical approach to CV. The mainstream CV is mainly born, I'm sure many of us already know, is born of US and UK initiatives around the mid 2000s. And it was coined, the term was coined by some of the practitioners, and later it was embraced by the academics. And afterwards it rapidly followed by adoption by other Western countries. Traditionally, countering violent extremism is based, it draws upon the traditional extremism theory. And extremism theory holds that the radicals in general display less sophisticated level of reasoning than the moderates, because they are attempting to simplify an overly complex reality. Consequently, in CV, as we have also heard, in the CV, extremists are assumed the bearer of immoderate social, religious, or political behavior outside the norm. And we also define violent extremism as a politically motivated act. So the extremism or extremist vocabulary actually now has permeated even in the public discourse. And not only that, but strangely enough also among the terrorists. I'm sure you must have heard that Ayman al-Zawahiri had called the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the method by Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as too extreme. And I have also read in the publication by Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, imputing similar level of allegations to the state functionaries in Pakistan, calling the state functionaries or even other members of civil society as extremist. So it is a both way practice. So CV is essentially, as an action adjective, it is a policy and a program spectrum. And the latest material is also seeing it as as a counter-terrorism discourse. So in that way, it is connected to and a kind of successor to the whole language of radicalization and counter-radicalization. One of the pioneers of terrorism studies, Alex Smith, whom I just introduced, he has argued that extremism lacks a semantic core, which means it is not a concept. It does not offer any meaning by itself till such time that there is a benchmark associated with it, for example, moderate. So in that way, extremism, the notion of extremism has been called a relational concept. And I just wish to show you one slide, and which will give you an idea that which way CV is going. So if you can see this slide, and this is an observation by John Norton, who is also a very famous terrorism scholar. And he said that many CV approaches cannot define the specifics of what they are preventing, let alone how and when they have prevented it. So that is the perspective on the confusion of the state of knowledge. And there have appeared actually around 12,000 or so articles on the subject. And a major score of these articles have actually been asking question what CV is. And the second perspective is the middling or the moderate CV perspective. This draws on notion of prevention actually, hence called PVE, and aspires to address fundamental or structural drivers of extremism through engagement with affected communities, mainly the Muslim diaspora. Obviously, all of this knowledge has emanated from the West, so it's primarily directed in addressing the sources of instabilities in those countries. And it was this perspective, which was the notion of the prevention, which was actually brought forward by the Obama administration to eschew the concerns of the Muslim community. And it was actually then called, it was rebranded terrorism. The word terrorism was dropped, and instead we began to hear more at the official level terms like CV or CVE or PVE. So I therefore see prevention, violent extremism as fundamentally and sharply different from the countering violent extremism. And we've seen that in Scandinavian part of Western Europe has been motivated by this approach. The problem is that in the Western hemisphere, or in Europe or English-speaking countries, the focus is more on the pull factors. How the terrorist organizations or militant or extremist organization disseminate their propaganda, and what is the appeal in their propaganda that actually acts as an incentive or an attractive pull factor for youth to join them. Although originally the mindset who coined this term countering violent extremism, or as well as preventing violent extremism, the mindset was that they wanted to shift away the focus from what is known as pejoratively or politically charged term like terrorism. But that focus actually did not materialize into action, because if the focus was essentially that by introducing or by shifting attention to preventing violent extremism, if the focus was to address the structural causes that drive extremism, then that it could not achieve, because in the next type of the violent extremism, response to violent extremism, which I call blended CV and PV, and which is exemplified in the model that has been adopted by the United Kingdom in the PREVENT model. This was introduced in mid 2000s, and this is the oldest, I think, model of the CV. The problem is that the focus of many analysts there is to, and as well as of the state institution, is that finding people with potentially dangerous views before they become violent. So that way, many civil liberties, they have come under question, and we know that people have been incarcerated without any charge, and we also know that many communities have actually joined the fold of suspect communities. So this has been a problem with the PREVENT ever since. So eventually what the PREVENT has done is that it has conflated legitimate political aspiration, especially of the British Muslim youth, as violent extremism, and essentially for social control, rather than addressing the driver of violent conflict. And lamentably, I can relate this approach, this security-driven CVE approach in Pakistan, and where we find that PVE is only scantily addressed by a branch of security organizations, like by establishing institution in Swat like Sabaun, or some efforts by institute like Pakistan Institute of Peace Studies, Islamabad. Lastly, the last perspective is the critical perspective on CVE. The critical scholars see CVE essentially rooted or grounded in the US, in the harsh discourse of US-led global war on terror. This discourse was essentially grounded in us versus them, and evil versus good. So main problem that the critical scholars that they find with this approach, with the CV approach, that there is no empirical evidence in it. Violent extremism has not been very empirically vindicated. I mean, the academic research in terrorism studies is still in search of robust evidence to come up to prove, to respond to the question why people turn towards political violence or violence, anti-state violence for that matter. But there are lots of opinion on causes, but there is no consensus or agreement. And then the problem that the critical scholars find with the CV, notion of CV, is that CV assigns too much causal power and emphasis on the role of ideas in the causes of violence. Whereas the main contradiction is that the data on terrorists or on the real-time so-called extremist is very scant, because the terrorist or the real extremist, whom we consider as extremist, they do not avail themselves for for becoming part of experimental groups or even offering interviews. So CV from this perspective is essentially an abstraction. So all what is being done around the world, according to these scholars, is occurring in a vacuum. And that is why some of the scholars had also come up with the idea that there is a need for differentiating between cognitive violent extremism and behavioral violent extremism, because a person can renounce violence behaviorally, but he can still be radical. So, and we actually do not know if a person has renounced violence cognitively. So that is why they say that it is more important to focus on behavior rather than altering the mindset of an individual. And the second problem that critical scholars highlight is that extremism is a relative term. Extremism is a relative term. So what is unusual for a Western country may not be an abnormal assertion or a view in a country like Pakistan. So extremism is essentially socially mediated or culturally bound phenomena. So that way, there is no universal value. We cannot attach universal value to extremism. What is, I mean, if in a Western country, they might perceive installation of Sharia as extremism, which may not be such, which may not be the case in, say, in Pakistan. So this is the second problem that they highlight. So what the critical scholars emphasize is that they promote sensitivity to the subjectivity, an emancipatory approach, and they do not even recognize radicalization as some sort of a processual phenomena, which is the part of mainstream terrorism studies. They actually advocate that terrorism is not a permanent label. So a person may be an innocent in the past and can also become innocent in the future. So this this emphasis also led to grasp the mind of the object of study, whose perceptions are filtered through their beliefs and attitude as product of social learning of their environment. My own understanding, based on all of these studies and having talked to dozens of people, is, and having interacted with people in FATA, violent activists in FATA, my take on the subject is that I am for blending subjectivity and objectivity by interweaving rational with visceral. And my view is that whom we call extremists are in reality actually very rational people, and they are fully cognizant of the quite cost and benefit of calculation of their decision. And this I am referring to with particular note to active political activists, whom you call terrorists or insurgents or rebel. And I want to show you a slide of one slide and two remarks, quotes from two great scholars. So first is the context theory. This is by James Witt, and you can read that I'm quoting, contrary to extremism theory, extremists will display greater cognitive complexity, flexibility and tolerance of ambiguity than political moderates. So essentially he's arguing that so-called extremists of the left or of the right are they actually have the potential to understand the entire gamut or ladder of from simple to complex social phenomena. And likewise, Joseph Conrad in 1963 in his book, so he also said perverse reason has his own process. So I'm essentially saying that there is a need for recognizing complexity. So rather than seeing someone from one extreme, so there is a need for us to move to the middle and then see if or whether the other person is really an extremist, because it is only then possible that we can possibly come up with a response pathway that can address their concerns and can possibly convert their mindset to mainstream thought processes or values. What is happening with the current counter-violent extremism policy framework by the state or by the NGOs is that it securitizes the community or group or individual for whom it intends to do good. So it is essentially, to be honestly speaking, and with humility, I'm saying CV is essentially repugnant, and it is very offensive, and it is a non-starter. What we have seen in Pakistan during 2017, that part of police from one province tried to profile individuals from another ethnicity, and we know that that actually led to the rise of a very strong rights movement, and also to the growth of a very intense anti-state narrative. So coming over to the current state of knowledge, it primarily focuses on religiously framed violent extremism, and it focuses, as I mentioned earlier, on the pull factors, which is the meso level, which is the level of the organization. It focuses on jihadi organizations, on terrorist organizations, and extremist or sectarian organization, but it does not address the push factors, where the state is actually also can also be found to have committed certain mistakes in addressing the vulnerabilities, or in addressing the deprivation of the people. So mainly this type of literature is being published in North America, in Australia, and in Europe. And there is a greater cultural and geographical asymmetry in publications. This discourse, these publications, this literature is essentially Western dominated. And it is also my observation that empirical based research is less. And you will see this on a slide. So you can see on this slide, this is the state of the field in September 2018. And this is from one review of 6,000 articles which appeared on the Journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism in 2018 online, on 18, but in print form in 2020. So the graph that is shown before you, so these are essentially 148 articles which were found more embedded in empiricism by these authors. And you can see that the graph rose sharply from 2009 to 2010. And this was possible in response to the growth and rise of more violence in various parts of the world. And then from 2013 onward, in 2014 and 15, this was the time when Daesh was growing. So violent extremism suddenly also became very popular in Western countries, from where very large number of foreign fighters, they were joining Daesh. But an article that has appeared online on 16th July 21, a few days back, actually, written by Brian Phillips. So it shows you, and you can see on the bottom of the graph that the peak that was there in 2015 actually has now began to recede. So what I can see at this moment that the CV as a literature has already touched one peak, and it is on the downward trend, at least for the present time. So that is the state of knowledge, and there I will end my presentation. And although I have also certain figures, but I will stop there.
Thank you, Fayaz sir. Nice presentation. And I would congratulate you that we have learned a lot. We've got questions for you. Okay. There are few questions. One question is from Sana Hussain. How we can remove discrimination against religion, and how we can guide people in our community who are more sensitive to these topics. That is one question. And there is another question by Sayyid Muhammad Ali. He is actually asking about if you kindly shed some light on self-radicalization, the issue of self-radicalization, particularly this specific dimension in your perspective is very much will be appreciated. What he's saying. There is another question from Zishan Noor. Is state of 2018 showing that showing high, but after FATA points it's decreasing. Can we say after FATA points we improve a lot? I mean after FATA operation. Yeah. Sorry, it's related to FATF. Yeah, it's related to FATF, that after compliance of FATF conditions, what is the status of terrorism and extremism in Pakistan?
Can you, Dr. Saab, can you repeat the first question by Sana Saiba?
Okay. The first question is against religion. How can we remove discrimination against religion, and how we can guide people in our community? I'm unmute. Okay. Okay, the question is, how can we remove discrimination against religion, and how we can guide people in our community who are more sensitive to these topics? Sir, if you can unmute your phone.
Thank you. The first question by Ms. Sana is it's a difficult question. Maybe I'm not the best person to respond to this question, but I think having lived in this country all my life, I think religion has been politicized, number one. And I think we were a very peaceful country until 1985 or around that time. We had the sectarian differences, but those sectarian differences were not accentuated, were not sharpened, were not differentiated. But then later on we saw that a stream of politics which highlighted, which accentuated, which actually told me or told you that who I am religiously. So if we forgot who I am, who I am nationally, and we are now more into remembering or putting or labeling sectarian identities on each other. I feel that there is a need to revise the current academic curriculum in Pakistan. When I was interviewing one of the female from Sindh, from Hindu community. She told me, and I was interviewing and I was asking causes that the causes for persistent terrorism in Pakistan. And one of the causes that she highlighted is the two-nation theory. It is the consistent emphasis on two-nation theory. There is no denial of two-nation theory. No. But we are frozen into two-nation theory. We are seeing our religious minorities from the same two-nation theory which was there in the pre-partition. So there is a need for defreezing that. So you have to, Sana Saiba, read. There is a very important document by Joginder Nath Mandal, who was the law and the labor minister of Pakistan, and who was part of the federal cabinet. And he resigned on, I believe, 9th October 1950. And if you contact me, I can send you that letter. And you have to find out what was the state as regards persecution of minorities in this country, and whether or not has there been any change. I believe we have to stop teaching fiction in our books, which actually prevents from truth to coming up. And that is also one of the reasons for the hate speech. So we have to actually revise our academic discourse, and there can be a longer discussion, and do not express dissent. Do not express dissent. Accept pluralism. Accept me if I'm Hindu. Accept me if I'm anybody from any religion, but I'm a Pakistani. So I don't know. And then I think I need to be more and more educated on my religion so that I can I can correct people. If you permit me, Dr. Naeem, just 1 minute, more minute to, in response to this question. When our children were killed in Peshawar attack in December 2014, so one of the justification by Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan was that killing of children and women is permitted by the Prophet of Islam. And Khorasani, Muhammad Khorasani, who is the spokesperson of TTP, so he referred to Sahih Bukhari. I consulted Sahih Bukhari, and I consulted many scholars from Pakistan, very learned scholars from our country. And then I wrote a complete response to that. So there is no such mention. There cannot actually not be such thing that a prophet permitting the genocide of children, that just cannot happen. So this is how it has come, because we also do not know. We also are not very well aware. We can go talk much more on this particular issue, but I suggest Sana Saiba read Making Sense of Pakistan by Farzana Sheikh. Coming over to the question of self-radicalization, I personally do not believe on radicalization as something which is a processual phenomena. There is a very good novel, Confession of a Terrorist by Richard Jackson. And if you contact me, I can possibly ask Richard to send you any copy of that. So, I mean, if there is a lethal use of force, and if you are killing my children, if you are killing my siblings, so is there need for any kind of a radicalization phenomena to occur? Like there is there will be a rush of blood for revenge. So will you call that radicalism or something like that? Radicalization is actually also a misnomer. By the way, radicalism used to be a very positive, constructive word. Radical, even in the violent extremism literature, radicals are referred to as open-minded egalitarians. If you read a paper by Alex Smith on violent and non-violent extremism, there is nothing there. There can be moral outrage when you see something bad happening. I don't know if you can call that as self-radicalization or otherwise, but if we keep studying all perspective, balanced perspective of every side, there is less likelihood that we will become radicalized. has FATF
Dr. Fayaz sir, can we drop this question because we are running short of time? Yeah, that you can question can be uploaded on the Facebook and you can answer separately because we are running short of time. Is it okay?
fine.
Yeah, and thanks a lot, Fayaz sir, your comprehensive, response and your, comprehensive presentation. We really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. Our next speaker is Miss Samin Fatma, who will be speaking on parental intervention in early childhood in fostering civil engagement for a resilient community. Ms. Samin Fatma is currently a doctoral student at the Department of Public Administration, University of Karachi, and her PhD topic is the same on which she will be speaking. Ms. Samin Fatma has many achievements to her credit. She did her BS and MS from IBA and was awarded medals of honor in both degrees. She also received PAF Chief of Air Staff Silver Medal from Air Headquarters and 2 years merit scholarship by HEC for higher studies. Ms. Samin established a chain of schools named the Steps Academy, fulfilling her aim. Currently, she would I would give the mic to Miss Samin Fatma now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Naeem, for a very brief introduction of me. I hope I'm audible to everyone.
Yeah, you are audible.
Oh, great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank Dr. Shafqat Munir first because he has given me a few very ground statements for starting my conversation today. Very rightly said by Dr. Shafqat Munir. Number one, hater that starts from we and they. So this is very right. We always start doing these kind of emotions. हमारे build होना start हो जाते हैं right from once we differentiate between this is me, this is you. Plus, this is very important, and this is the beauty of communities to accept differences and diversity. Very true. And I would also like here to thank SDPI for providing such a great platform to talk about violent extremism and building community resilience. So he has given me a very good ground for building my topic presentation, which is also my thesis for PhD. And my topic is for parental intervention in early childhood in fostering civic engagement for a resilient community. The way Sir Dr. Shafqat said कि भाई जो नफरत होती है, hatred होती है, that starts from we and they. तो इसी तरह से ये वो चीजें हैं, वो difference of opinions हैं जो normally हम accept नहीं कर रहे होते हैं दूसरों के लिए. And this is where civic engagement comes into play, और जहाँ पे हम हमारे लिए बहुत important हो जाता है हम the role the parents had to play right from the beginning. कि वो किस तरह से इन चीज़ों को foster कर सकते हैं अपने बच्चों के अंदर, so that the communities can grow up free from violent extremism, and they can also build resilience in them. So together we are going to think about some roles the parents play, the gap that we see these days, and the missing link that we will be talking about down the presentation, and the relationship that we can create between children and communities. A quick reflection for all of us. Here on your screens, you can see multiple scenarios. I would love कि अगर आप लोग chat box use करते हुए अपने comments दें, और थोड़ा सा quickly, even if you are not parents, तो आप इस चीज़ को ज़रूर आप लोगों ने observation में आप लोगों के रही होगी कि how do children react या parents का किस तरह से behavior होता है, what kind of reactions do parents give usually when children come home कि वो किसी competition में they lost the game. So how do they nurture children to welcome that defeat open-heartedly, to accept that defeat? Secondly, अगर कभी-कभार ऐसा होता है कि you go for a shop and if the cashier gives you handovers to you some additional change, तो क्या करते हैं? क्या आप उसको रख लेते हैं अपनी पॉकेट में या आप उसको रिटर्न कर देते हैं? What kind of behavior do parents show in front of children normally जब हम देख रहे होते हैं कि traffic lights red है और हमें जल्दी में जाना है, तो क्या हम रुकते हैं या do we rush? What do we do while we are traveling? क्या हम जो खा रहे होते हैं during traveling उसका जो trash होता है, do we keep that in cars to be thrown later या हम उसको फेंक देते हैं? हमारा काम अक्सर हम ये देख रहे होते हैं अपनी सोसाइटी में, स्पेशली व्हेन वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट पाकिस्तान, कि हम अक्सर बाहर फेंक रहे होते हैं. Do we use water in excess? क्या हम उनको water consumption, water conservation सिखा रहे होते हैं? क्या हम उनको एक चीज बोल रहे होते हैं कि you have to close your taps if you are not using water? Are we blowing unnecessary horns in front of them जबकि हमें पता है कि traffic rush है? Are we cutting queues जब हम shopping कर रहे होते हैं, हम lines को cut करते हुए जा रहे होते हैं कि भाई हमें जल्दी है, बस थोड़ा सा सामान है हमारा, हम आगे निकल जाता है? Are we littering public properties with trash? हम अपने बच्चों को, जिस तरह से सर ने चीज एक कोट की थी कि मौलाना और एक क्रिश्चियन उनके जो थे स्कॉलर उनका, that he said कि जो beliefs हैं, certain beliefs of Christianity are not correct. तो वहाँ पे ये जो चीज है, this is where we need to teach our children what is the right words, kind usage of words क्या है जो किसी के emotions को hurt ना करे. कितनी दफा ऐसा होता है कि हम अपने बच्चों को पैसिवली वो चीजें नहीं सिखा रहे होते हैं जो नॉर्मली हम नहीं सिखाना चाह रहे होते. So this is what I want you all to think about for a moment in time. Somebody is saying that I am not audible. Am I? Please somebody let me know if I am audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, great. So these are some things जो हम अपने parenting के styles के through सिखा रहे होते हैं. We have two ways to teach our children. One is actively and one is passively. Actively तो वो होता है जो हम उनको deliberately with conscious अपनी जो understanding से उनके through सिखा रहे होते हैं. But passively we are also teaching them through our responses and through our behaviors. Many times हम बहुत aware होते हैं इस चीज को कि what we are conveying to our children is not correct, appropriate नहीं है. बहुत दफा हम unconsciously उस चीज को deliver कर रहे होते हैं. So this is very important here जहाँ पे we are talking about violent extremism, we are talking about resilience. So this comes very much into play. Okay, we need to teach our children what is being missing here. So here I would like to say one thing, कि each day of our lives we make the experiences that children face during early years remain with them throughout the course of their lives. So we know कि parents और जो children है उनका जो relationship है, that is of the first teacher, and parents remain the best teacher throughout their children's life. So children from birth are goal directed to experiment and learn from experience. So it is very important कि जो we know कि parent और child का जो relationship है, that is more like scaffolding. Just the way scaffolding is to support the structure of building as it is being built and gradually taken down as the building can now stand on its own. Similarly, जो parents होते हैं, they provide support to the child to safely and productively explore and learn from environment. There are so many theories that can relate the bonding and the relationship between parent and a child. और normally इस चीज को हम खुद भी identify करते हैं कि if the parents are expressive in their styles, अगर पेरेंट्स बच्चों को हग कर रहे होते हैं, एक फिजिकल अफेक्शन प्रोवाइड कर रहे होते हैं, तो सिमिलरली बच्चों के अंदर भी ये चीज डेवलप हो जाती है. So this is very important that children should have strong relationships with their parents right from the early years, because this is where जहाँ पे उनके minds grow होना start हो जाएंगे, उनके experiences उनके साथ throughout the life रहेंगे. So, this is where jahan pe they need to start a good life, and for that they need to have a good relationship with their parents, so that they are well equipped with human and social capital for success as they step into school and further later into societies. Now, what gap can you see here? इनिशियली हमने बात की कि वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट सर्टेन सिनेरियोज और इस तरह के बहुत सारे डेली बेसिस पे वी हैव इंटरेक्शंस विद चिल्ड्रन जो कि हम उनको कर रहे होते हैं. नाउ द प्रॉब्लम इज, एंड वी नो दैट द अर्ली इयर्स आर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर किड्स, सो नाउ द गैप इज that we as parents usually explicitly focus on improving cognitive language numeracy skills and somehow inculcating civic sense in children is left behind. हम उनको ये तो सिखा रहे होते हैं कि you have to learn academically how you prosper, आप अपने academic competitions को किस तरह से embrace करना है, किस तरह से take up करना है, हम ये सारी चीजें उन्हें सिखा रहे होते हैं, but we left them unguided, usually unprepared for value formation, character building, and focusing on ethical standards. इनके ऊपर we usually don't give adequate emphasis. इसको हमें लग रहा होता है कि this is something जो कि वो जब they will move ahead वो खुद ही सीखेंगे, but no. This is where जो हमें बहुत ज़्यादा important है और हमें काम करने की ज़रूरत है as a parent उनके साथ. Now, as we see what kind of a link that is being missing there, हम passively उन्हें क्या चीज़ें सिखा रहे हैं, हम explicitly we are working on their cognitive skills, but what is being missed is your civic sense. Most of us are born with 5 senses, exceptionally few with a 6th sense, but nobody is born with civic sense. So as a child, it is very important जहाँ पे हम उन्हें cognitive skills सिखा रहे हैं. Similarly, it is very important that we also make them learn the civic attitudes, the civic beliefs कि किस तरह से उनको society में how they should function and how can be they part of the an integral part of the society. So civic sense normally हम जब बात करते हैं we only consider कि public places को साफ रखना और यही चीज होती है, but no, this is not the case. Civic sense is your social ethics, most commonly the unspoken social norms of society. This is not just about keeping your roads, streets, and public property clean, but it is also to do with your laws, respecting others, जिस तरह से अभी हमने बात की कि difference of opinion, diversity, differences को accept करना. This is also civic sense is about. Then we have to show etiquettes, maintain decorum, and tolerance for diversity. Civic sense comes from the sense of belonging, which creates pride and a sense of ownership. We must instill social values in children, so that कि ये जो चीजें उनकी second nature बन के सामने, which is very important if we want to have our children to have a better tomorrow. So this is very important कि हम उनके अंदर civic attitudes और civic beliefs को strong करें right from the early years. और ये वो चीजें हैं that we can do actively जो कि हम कर रहे होते हैं, but passively usually हम miss out कर जाते हैं कहीं ना कहीं. So probably sometimes consciously, but most of the time unconsciously. So now today, the great need is where now the parents, they have to extend their roles. Besides being the conventional role of everyday development, what they need to do, they need to actively take on the role. ऐसा उनको participation बच्चों की शुरू से अपने साथ ऐसी involvement रखनी है, where they can grow up to be the better citizen, who is concerned about welfare of others, not only at the personal level, but also at the societal level. So this is very important that parents promote civic attitudes and behaviors right from adolescence, so they can continue to grow and nurture same in the adulthood as well. It is actually the parental engagement in civic and social causes that is associated with children's civic commitment. जितना हम कहते हैं कि जो behavior हम parents show कर रहे होते हैं अपने बच्चों को, जो चीजें हम उनको सिखा रहे होते हैं, वही वो चीजें होती हैं जो further reflect कर रहे होते हैं. So this is very important and a lot of research has been done on this and is being shared कि जो parental engagement जितनी ज़्यादा होती है civic और social causes में, उतना ही डायरेक्टली प्रोपोर्शनेट आपके जो बच्चे होते हैं उनकी civic commitment होती है. I would like to share words of Andy Sensen here, who rightly said that the sign of great parenting is not the child's behavior. I repeat, the sign of great parenting is not the child's behavior. The sign of truly great parenting is the parent's behavior. So यहाँ पे this is where I would like to talk, talk about my topic in a crux कि यहाँ पे हम बात कर रहे हैं कि parents का जो behavior है towards social issues, civic issues, that is more important in building up the behavior and shaping up the behavior of our kids for future. Now, before looking further, हम जिस तरह से resilience की बात कर रहे हैं, community resilience की बात कर रहे हैं, I would like everyone to come on one page, and for that I would like to share कि भाई resilience होती क्या है. Probably many of you would have known, but still, so I just want everybody to be on the same page. So resilience की जब हम बात करते हैं, resilience is typically the capacity to recover from difficult life events. There is no single person जो ये कहे कि उसने कभी अपनी life में कोई difficult events face नहीं की. Everybody faces at their own levels. अगर एक बच्चा होगा, especially like we are, our topic of interest जो है इसमें हम बच्चों की बात कर रहे हैं, तो even बच्चे, they are facing the hardships in form of अगर उनका कोई favorite toy टूट जाता है, उनकी कोई favorite dish नहीं बनी होती है, उनको वो चीज़ खाना नहीं होता, तो वो कहीं ना कहीं अपने emotions को, अपने adversities को कहीं ना कहीं वो show कर रहे होते हैं, वो उसको overcome भी करते हैं. Resilience is something जो हम सबके अंदर होती है कहीं ना कहीं, because we all come out through the difficult phases of our life. We bounce forward. Resilience is mainly bouncing forward and growing despite life's downturns. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि resilience का हरगिज़ से मतलब नहीं है कि we are not experiencing stress, we are not going through emotional upheavals, we are not suffering. No. But this is more about कि हम जो है वो उन failures को accept करें. We are not embarrassed by our failures, but we are learning them and we are starting again. So this is very important कि हम resilience अपने because it starts from individual level. Resilience start ही individual level से. Then it grows up to the level जहाँ पे हम community resilience की बात कर रहे हैं, जहाँ पे हम national और international level पे हम बात कर रहे होते हैं. So it starts from an individual. और इंडिविजुअल में भी हम स्टार्ट कर रहे हैं कि हमें अपने बच्चों को भी रेजिलिएंट बनाना है, so that they can grow up into responsible citizens that can contribute towards your resilient society. Now, if we see that हम जब जो resilience होती है, that is a long-term perspective. So it is very important that resilience is rightly manifested from early years of childhood. So when we start learning the civic attitudes हो हमारे अंदर, civic beliefs हमारे strong हो बच्चों को लेकर, हम उनके अंदर ऐसे attitudes, ऐसे behavior instill करें, ऐसी knowledge दें उनको, that helps that so that they aim towards improving society and contributing to the common good. They have those competencies and behaviors जहाँ पे they work together as a community, as people, and promote well-being. वहाँ पे हम कहते हैं कि दिस इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट कि जो रेजिलियंस है दैट इज देयर इन द मैनिफेस्टो, क्योंकि आप उसी वक्त रेजिलियंस शो कर रहे होते हैं जब आपको पता है यू आर कनेक्टेड, you have that support, only then you become more and more resilient. Only then you come out of adversities more in a more better way. So it is very important कि जो बच्चे हों उनके अंदर हम एक थ्रू सिविक इंगेजमेंट उनको रेसिलियंट भी कर सकते हैं, जो कि फर्दर टेकअप कर सकते हैं. They can have social, they can prove the attributes of social competency, problem solving skills, autonomy, decision making के उनके अंदर sense आ जाता है. Most importantly sense of purpose है, sense of purpose है और sense of participation है. So this is very important कि यहाँ पे हम उनको क्या चीज दे रहे हैं. Then we see that the civic engagement has a direct relation to the communities. Communities have interdependent relationships. So it is very important to have a sense of connection with one's community. Communities grow stronger when everyone has opportunity to contribute. और अगर हमारे individuals are engaged, they are more resilient, तो हम economically भी ज़्यादा बेहतर तरीके से foster कर सकते हैं. And plus this connection and support can build into social capital, fosters equity and social trust, which are the basic drivers of resilient communities. Lastly, I would like to say कि besides the role of the school, society and environment, it is the foremost duty of parents to play a dual role, one as a nurturer and one as a structurer. As a nurturer, they have to take care of basic needs like food, medical, shelter, education, and provide children with love and affection, acceptance that leads to self-esteem and social well-being. Or as a structure, they need to work on providing direction, enforcement of rules, discipline, confinements, inculcating sense of responsibility and imparting virtues that will lead to the more responsive conduct of a child, which will mature and grow into effective social capital. So they will also become more tolerant towards aggravation and less egocentric. Lastly, there are three broad, the parental engagements can impart three broader ways. If they provide caring and supportive relationship, that will motivate children to learn and want to succeed. Similarly, अगर इनका ये जो supportive relationship है ये continue रहता है, that will also help in achieving the high expectations that are being laid by society for children, and they will show lesser behavior problems. जिस तरह से हम बात कर रहे होते हैं violent extremism की और इन सारी चीजों की. Plus the opportunities, if they have that meaningful involvement, this will lead to responsive behavior and will foster traits of resilience that will further take up, continue to grow as community resilience. I would like to end my session on the words of Joyce Maynard. It's not only children who grow, parents do too. As much as we watch to see what our children do with their lives, they are watching us to see what we do with ours. I can't tell my children to reach for the sun. All I can do is to reach for it myself. Thank you very much for your concentration. I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Samin Fatma, for your comprehensive and a nice presentation. What we'll do, since we are running short of time, what we can do, the audience, you can, send your questions to the chat box or in the chat. We can, deliver these questions to the speaker, Ms. Samin Fatma, and she can respond to your questions accordingly. So without, wasting much time, I am pleased to directly invite Mr. Tariq Parvez, who is the former national coordinator, NECTA. Let me introduce him. Mr. Tariq Parvez joined police services of Pakistan in the rank of Assistant Superintendent of Police in 1973 and retired in the rank of Inspector General of Police in 2008 from the post of Director General of FIA. Uh, Being in police service, he dealt with the cases of extremism and terrorism. After retirement, he tasked to establish the National Counterterrorism Authority, NECTA, and appointed its first national coordinator. In 2013, he was appointed as Home Minister in the uh, Punjab province in the caretaker setup. Presently, he is the member of NECTA's Committee of Experts as well as President Advisory Board, National Initiative Against Organized Crimes. He has published a number of research papers and reports on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. He is awarded Sitara Imtiaz by the President of Pakistan in the year 2004 for his services in the field of counterterrorism. So, over to Tariq Parvez Sahab.
Sarisa, please unmute yourself.
जी आवाज आ रही है?
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Please. Clear. Welcome. Thank you.
अच्छा. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Naim, and I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me over to share my views on the subject of counter-violent extremism in Pakistan. I'm honored indeed. The specific topic which I have been given to speak on is the role of NECTA in counter-violent extremism in Pakistan. My conversation shall be very broadly into three parts. The first one is very briefly existing strategy of counter-violent extremism. Then the second part is role of NECTA. And finally, some suggestions. NECTA. आवाज आ रही है?
There is a problem in your voice.
आवाज आ रही है?
कुछ इशू आ रहा है आपकी तरफ से.
अभी बेहतर है? Is it better?
No, it's better.
अभी बेहतर है आवाज डॉक्टर नहीं?
Great.
Your voice is breaking.
Can you hear me?
Your voice is breaking. Your voice is breaking.
आवाज आ रही है मेरी कि नहीं? आवाज आ रही है मेरी कि नहीं?
Yeah, now better. It's better now.
आप लोगों की आवाज टूट रही है अभी.
बेहतर है.
Am I audible now? मुझे तो आपकी आवाज नहीं आ रही है. अगर मेरी आवाज आ रही है तो मुझे बता दें. I'll start off.
बोले.
Yeah, if you can speak now,
Can you hear me?
you are audible.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Tariq sir, we can hear you. आपकी आवाज आ रही है.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, for inviting me. Thank you very much for inviting me on counter-violent extremism. The topic I've been given to speak on is the role of NECTA in counter-violent extremism in Pakistan. My conversation shall be very broadly divided into three parts. First, a brief on the existing strategy against for counter-violent extremism. Secondly, role of NACTA, and third is suggestions on the way forward. Uh, uh, Before I go on to my presentation, a brief comment on what Fayaz said in his paper about securitization of counter-violent extremism. That is what I understood. That is a very, very important point in my view, for the very simple reason that the lead players in counter-violent extremism are absolutely different from the lead players of counter-terrorism. Yet we insist on counter-violent extremism being dealt with by the security operators. I think that is a very, very important point. It's the academia, it's the religious leaders, it's the media, it's the educationists who should be the lead players in our response to violent extremism. Having said that, I move on to the basic points of my presentation. The first one is about the existing strategy. Well, first of all, I think it is very gratifying to note that during the last 4 or 5 years, ever since 2015, there has been a consistent and significant, to the extent of 85%, reduction in the number of terrorist attacks, which is something very, very encouraging. Uh, but the weak area in that response was the lack of the total emphasis on kinetic aspect of counterterrorism, pakdo, vakdo, maro, ye karo, wo karo, and lack of interest on the non-kinetic dimension of counterterrorism. And when you uh, lay down the importance of violent extremism or counter-violent extremism, then what you are doing is you are not addressing the ideology of the militants at all. And what keeps a terrorist organization going is its ideology. Well, we got away with it so far, but we cannot do it anymore for the very simple reason that there is a totally new dimension to the terrorism aspect in Pakistan as a result of the Taliban victory, or whatever you can say, superiority, and the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Uh, we are likely to have an unprecedented blowback, ideological blowback from Afghanistan, strengthening the religious elements within Pakistan and similarly extremist organizations. And that will be a new ball game altogether. And that necessitates that we give greater importance to violent extremism. There has to be a balance between kinetic measures as well as non-kinetic measures. So that's the basic point. In fact, you might have noticed that the narrative of the militants is already on. You might have noticed in social media, there is a video clip of two men being hanged in Afghanistan for having carried out the trafficking of small boys. And the comment is that this is what we need in Pakistan also. They took only 2 days to hang these people. So that is the narrative. And when you talk about counter-violent extremism, this emphasizes that improving the criminal justice system should be a part of our counter-narrative. And another part of our counter-narrative is that if we don't go by the due process of law, what are the effects? How is it going to affect the judgments? The point I want to make is that the narrative of the militants is already there in the social media, and we need to hurry up. Now, NACTA's role. what is the need of having NECTA? Why have NECTA at all? Uh, Basing on my personal experience as head of counterterrorism department Punjab for 7 long years, uh, I came to the conclusion that the counterterrorism effort in Pakistan was fragmented. It was fragmented between the provinces. I had a lot of difficulty in talking to the anti-terrorism departments in Sindh, Balochistan, and KP. There was no formal mechanism to help me do it. There was no contact at all. And we did not share intelligence. If there was anything at all, it was on an informal basis. And I felt that there was a need of an institution at the federal level which should coordinate and collate the efforts of the provincial cities and the provincial governments. The second point, which I noted as the head of Punjab, was that our uh, approach was lopsided. There was no one to guide us. I mean, it was lopsided in the sense that we went by the traditional system of kinetic measures. Get hold of a man and find out his network, and then that's it. But nothing to do with his ideology. We did not have place any emphasis on countering the narrative or countering the ideology. The whole emphasis was on Pakar. So the effort we have to have a balance between kinetic and non-kinetic if you want to have a long-term impact on terrorism in the country. And the third thing which impressed me at that time was that we did not have any direction, any national direction. कि करना क्या है? Everybody was working hard day and night, but in their own silos, in their own compartments, and doing whatever the thought was best. So these were the two areas which I felt were lacking in the national counterterrorism effort in Pakistan. And in 2008, when I was DGFIA, I proposed to the government that there is a need to set up a civilian institution at the federal level to integrate the national counterterrorism effort. And as a result of that, uh, the government very kindly agreed, and through an executive order in January 2009, NACTA, National Counterterrorism Authority, was set up with the mandate of formulating policies on counterterrorism and counter-violent extremism, and monitoring the implementation of these, carry out research to understand the different aspects of counter-violent extremism, and coordinate intelligence. So these were the three broad areas uh, which with which the NACTA was set up. It was set up by an executive order in 2009, and it took 4 years to have a law called National Counterterrorism Authority Act in 2013, after 4 years. So that indicates how much strong the political resolve to go for this institution. And then, besides the legal mandate, one national action plan, a unique document in the sense that it has a political consensus of all the important stakeholders. All the political parties endorsed it, all the provinces endorsed it, all segments of society, civil and military, endorsed it. In that national action plan, point number 4 was that NACTA should be activated and strengthened. The national action plan, which exists even today, made it focal point to strengthen NACTA. But of course, nothing much has happened on the ground so far. The important thing to keep in mind here is that NACTA has only a strategic role. It has no operational role. It does not collect intelligence. It's not It's supposed to keep itself above the operational levels and involved at the strategic level to carry out threat assessments independently after getting input from all the organizations to suggest the way forward to give different options to the government. So it was more of a strategic role. Now coming to the performance of NECTA. NECTA came up with National Internal Security Policy 1. I think it was from 2013 to 2018 probably. National Internal Security Policy 2, 2018 to 2023. But no one has ever read it. No one has ever heard of it. These two policies, I haven't seen anything happening on the ground as a result of these two policies. So that, as normally happens here, we are very fond of making plans, but we do not give any importance to the implementation of these plans. So we can say that NECTA that way is working much below its potential. It can achieve a lot more. Prove its worth in the case of FATF by being the focal institution for framing the response of the government to the demands of FATF. That 26 points out of 27 have been completed. And NACTA has an important role to play in coordinating this effort. So the point I want to make here is that if given due support and resources and all that, NACTA can deliver even in the area of counter-violent extremism, as it has done in the case of FATF. So that brings me to the last part, suggestions on way forward. The most important suggestion is that the government needs to acknowledge the role of NACTA, both in counterterrorism and in counter-violent extremism, to formulate a strategy, to monitor implementation, to carry out threat assessment, and and there should be. I find it very disheartening to note that in most of the national security conferences, I don't find the head of NACTA there. And unless the government gives importance to NACTA, no other stakeholder will take it seriously. So that is the first point. The government needs to acknowledge and give it its due legally mandated role. What role law has given to this organization. The second point is NACTA needs an enabling environment. It does not work in a vacuum. It needs support. And the most important thing, I would suggest that we need to do two important things. The first one is develop clarity about violent extremism. What as Fayaz mentioned earlier, there is lack of ambiguity in how to define violent extremism, like in terrorism. And this is all over. It's a very complicated subject and very difficult to define. But as he very rightly pointed out, this बात की समझ नहीं आई उसको counter क्या करेंगे. But in our country, violent extremism has become even more contentious in the sense that some dimensions of extremism have gained some level of popular acceptance also. And it's lack of clarity. For example, if somebody asks you, who is Mumtaz Qadri? Is he an assassin who was executed on the order of the Supreme Court, or is he hero, where, as many people believe, like that? So how do we take it? How do we remove this confusion? We have to think very seriously about it. And similarly, Um, there is a lack of clarity about constitutes extremism. I'm reminded of a few years back in one of the schools in Lahore, a chapter was introduced on comparative religion. And there was a program on a television condemning this fact and saying that why do our children need to be taught about other religions? We need not be about that. Government of the day, provincial government of the day forced that school to take out that chapter and to burn those books if they can't do that. And otherwise their license would be cancelled and all that. Government buckled it. So, I mean, we talk about extremism, that's all right. But we have to be very clear about what do you mean by it. If even having chapters of other religion, one chapter, just to tell you that there is, besides Islam, there are other religions, is treated by some people as objectionable, then I don't know. This is something in which we need to have more clarity. The second area in which we need to have more clarity is the drivers of extremism or violent extremism. Uh, Unfortunately, maybe you know better because I'm not into the, academia or research, but my own perception is that we do not have any solid research to indicate what are the drivers of violent extremism in Pakistan on a national level. There are people who say madrasas are sort of nurseries for extremism. But is there any research to substantiate that? Is there any data to substantiate that? As head of NECTA, I try to carry out a research program about personal profiling of the imprisoned. I said, let's not go about anything else, but the terrorists who are imprisoned, we should let's profile them and find out how many of them are from madrasas and how many are not. Unfortunately, that could not happen. But then there is, I can refer to two studies. Mariam Abu Zahab says that it is false to claim that religion is the basic factor which is responsible for extremism. According to her, it is the social conditions, and she has taken the case study of Dhyan. Similarly, Dr. Rabia Zafar, her point of view is that extremism, spreading extremism is sort of an entrepreneurship. Uh, but my point is, uh, I don't know, it might have changed now, but normally our policies and our responses are based on anecdotes or on stories. When I was there, this happened, and this is not how policies are made. So we need to find out scientifically through the academia about drivers of, it's very simple to say the poverty is not because many poor people are not very, that's okay. But we would like to have some scientific studies on this. So I remember the interior minister once upon a time saying that 10% of the madrasas had the links with the militant. So I spoke to him and I said that if 20,000, there are 20,000 madrasas in the whole country. What you mean, Minister, is that 2,000 madrasas have links with the militants or extremists. And if every madrasa is passing out 50 boys every year, then it means that 100,000 boys are added to the mainstream every year. From where have you got this figure? He said the intelligence agencies say that. So that's no way. That's no way. There are people who say that madrasas have got nothing to do with extremism. There are people who say that madrasas have got everything to do. I'm not saying anything about it. My only point of view is that we must study it in a scientific way, based on data, based on research, based on intelligence. Um, so that is one thing that we need to have clarity about the meaning of violent extremism if we want to address clarity on the basis of research. The second is to develop political will to combat violent extremism. Normally, uh, the political leadership is shy of taking on the issues pertaining to terrorism or extremism. It's contentious. They do not know what is likely to be the response of the people, so they better stay away. But unless and until you have strong political will to deal with the issue of violent extremism, you cannot deal with it. No organization will take on the extremists unless and until they have the support of the political government. पकड़ते हैं जूस निकल आता है सारा कुछ हो जाता है दे स्टार्ट ब्लेमिंग कि जी ये आपने क्यों किया है ये छोड़ दें जी इसको सुलह कर लें जी ये कर लें जी वो कर लें so we need to have strong political will आप देखें every government every report every speaker will say that madrasas should be registered have madrasas been registered not to the best of my knowledge maybe 10% maybe 15% 20% why can't the government enforce this thing. I know there will be a lot of resistance on everything. Either you say that they should be registered or you say it shouldn't be registered. If you say that they should be registered, then it has to be enforced. This is just one example I'm giving you of a weak political will. And as I've already stated, the chapter about comparative religions, what does it indicate? It indicates political will. The point I want to make is that the issue of extremism has political sensitivities, and one has to be very, very clear about this thing as to how best to go about it. And the political leadership sets the tone for these policies, these strategies, and these actions. So the point here I want to make is that NACTA can be effective only as much as the government wants it to. If the government lacks political will, it would be futile to expect NACTA to suggest something to on that. And NACTA has submitted guidelines on counter-violent extremism in 2018. These guidelines are still awaiting any response, and no further action has been taken. So that was about enabling environment. The second point to improve the performance of NACTA is to enhance its effectiveness. And for that, the first point I make is that NACTA should be directly responsible to the Prime Minister. It is very unfortunate that there is a strong lobby in the Interior Ministry that they won't let go of NACTA. And this bureaucratic tough war is leading to ineffectiveness of NACTA. And to be very honest, it was on this ground only that I resigned from NACTA. I said if it's not going to be responsible to the Prime Minister, it's not going to take off. It won't be taken seriously by the stakeholders. Um, we have very powerful stakeholders, and the provincial governments, the ISI, the IB, and if you have to coordinate with these stakeholders, then you have to have that stature. And I remember during my discussions in 2009 with the ISI, the IB, and others, they were very frank about it that we will take you more seriously. The organization will be taken more seriously if they report to the Prime Minister and not Interior Minister, because Interior Minister is just another minister. So it is critical for NACTA, responsible to the Prime Minister if it wants to be taken seriously and to deliver. I remember there was a meeting of the European Union who had come to Islamabad with some donations. And I asked for a meeting from all the ministries who were concerned in this. some ministers sent section officers, some deputy secretaries, and some said that, well, we were not prepared. We were asked to join the meeting on the spur of the moment. Why? Because they knew that they are responsible to the Ministry of Interior. Resultantly, the European Union looked at me and they said, you people are not serious about it. So this is a critical factor. It's not a question of tough war or something else. From NACTA's perspective, it is critical for NACTA's success. It is if we want the looming threat in the light of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan to be tackled effectively, then we have to be responsible to the Prime Minister. And then we have to build expertise in counter-violent extremism, which means three things: threat assessment, developing response, data collection, and analysis. NACTA should be manned by experts in different fields. NACTA should be manned by experts in different fields. And finally, effective coordination mechanism. Unless and until there is an effective coordination mechanism to coordinate with the stakeholders, this organization cannot deliver. The basic point in the end, which I would like to say, is that if government is to give importance to counter-violent extremism, the essential first step is to, as National Action Plan says, activate and strengthen NACTA. NACTA will have to be the legally mandated focal institution to lead the effort against violent extremism. Thank you very much, Dr. Naeem.
Okay, thanks a lot, for eloquently highlighting the role of NACTA and touching upon very sensitive issues on which there is a lack of clarity in Pakistani society. And you have rightly said that there is a lack of research and data on the drivers of violent extremism in the Pakistani society.
We have two questions for you. One is by Fayaz Saab. How much is the role of state in breeding extremism? That is one question for you. Another question is from Irfan Hussain. He's saying, dear sir, other countries have madrasas as well, but these countries don't have problems with their madrasas as we do. Please enlighten us on this. Do we have them as a tool for proxy wars or as B teams? Thank you.
Sorry. Did you hear my question or not?
Tariq sir, did you hear my question? Tariq sir, did you hear my question?
Sir, did you hear my question?
He's not hearing.
He's not hearing.
Am I audible, Tariq sir, to you?
Am I audible, Tariq sir?
Tariq sir, can you hear me?
Can you hear?
Tariq sir, are we audible to you? Tariq sir, there are two questions in the chat box. You can, if you can answer. The first question is from Mr.
Fayaz Saab.
Fayaz Saab, that how much is the role of the state
in breeding,
in
breeding
breeding extremism?
How much?
What is the role of state in breeding the extremism? The role of the state in breeding the extremism.
Role of state in spreading extremism?
Yes.
Very important question. I think those of us who were grown up in 1970s, we know the Pakistan of that time was a very tolerant Pakistan, and there were isolated cases of extremism, and extremists were totally marginalized. There were no militant organizations in Pakistan at that time. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and Pakistan decided to send volunteers from Pakistan to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets. And number one, number two, it was decided that we should use the concept of jihad to motivate the boys from Pakistan to go and fight in Afghanistan. So the state policy was to encourage volunteers, to encourage people to go and fight in Afghanistan. The militant organizations like Harkatul Mujahideen, Harkatul Jihad-e-Islami, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and others, they were encouraged to recruit people and send them to Afghanistan. So I think that the role of the state in spawning extremism in 1980s was a very, very significant factor. And unfortunately, we did not factor in that these people, when they are done with the jihad in Afghanistan, they'll come back home. They have their own agendas. They have their own plans. And I remember meeting some of the leaders of Chapai Sahaba at that time, because they were known to me, and they told me that they are sending volunteers to Afghanistan to fight so that they have that experience, and when they come back, they'll be used against the Shias. And similarly, from the Shia side, they were militant. So I would, as a reaction, so I would say that the state, and then you would recall that after General Zia passed the Zakat, tried to pass a law of Zakat ordinance, Tehreek-e-Jafriya Pakistan came into existence, and they forced General Zia to take back the law. And then Sipai Sahaba was formed, and after that, Sipai Muhammad was formed, and then Lashkar-e-Jhangi was formed. So my point is that the state had an important role because it was a state policy to radicalize people and send them to Afghanistan.
Tariq Parvez, if you can answer it very briefly to another question related to the role of madrasas. I mean, there's a comparison of Pakistani madrasas and the madrasas situated in other countries, in other Muslim countries particularly. So why there is no problem in other Muslim countries related to madrasas, and why we are facing problems in Pakistan?
Because the other countries do not have Afghanistan as a neighbor. That was in a lighter way. The situation in Afghanistan, as I said earlier, the government of Pakistan decided to send volunteers from Pakistan to Afghanistan, and madrasa students were encouraged to send their students to Afghanistan. Those who were graduated or whatever. So madrasa was one of the platforms. There were other platforms also. There were militant organizations, there were religious organizations, but madrasas were one of the platforms from where was used to recruit the volunteers and to be sent to Afghanistan. I remember, let me share something very interesting with you. I met a person who said that he was a mujahideen, one of the mujahideen, and he said that for the first time they went to a madrasa in Jhang in early 1980s, and they met the administration and said that we want volunteers to be sent to Afghanistan. They were thrown out. The teacher said that, look, these boys are studying, let them complete the studies, and whenever they're done with their studies, then you can think of jihad or anything else. So that was one stage. But then ultimately, they infiltrated into the madrasas, and madrasas became one of the factors. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Tariq Sahab, for your very nice and comprehensive presentation. And I hope our audience must have learned a lot. So without taking much time, I invite Dr. James Witt, who is the professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and director of the Institute of Immigration Research. He has earned his PhD from Harvard University in the year 1991 and has been a professor at Clemson University and Northwestern University. Since coming to Mason University in 2009, Witt's major projects have included the privately funded Institute for Immigration Research, the National Science Foundation funded Digital Archive project, and served as the co-principal investigator for the university partnership with the University of Karachi, funded by the US State Department. And he is speaking on analytical tools for understanding and designing counter-violent extremism framework. So over to Dr. James Witt.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. Good evening to you. Assalamu alaikum. I was able to listen to some of the earlier presentations and found them quite informative. I think what I'm going to do today is on a slightly different level or a different approach, where the focus is going to be not as Mr. Parvez was talking about, sort of things to think about of extremism and promotion of community resilience, but rather to think about how we just discover and study the origins and processes that lead to extremism and can be then used to develop resiliency in communities. So I've got a few slides I want to show, which I think I can do. No, that's not doing it. Hang on one second. All right, there we go. And again, what I'm going to be talking about is the analytical tools we can use for understanding and designing a framework, a means to study violent extremism as well as community resilience. But I think first what I want to make a quick point is that this is not just an issue in particular regions of the world. It's a global issue. And these may be images that you are familiar with, but I think it's important for this to set the stage. This is a protest that turned violent in Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017. There were a number of injuries. One woman was killed when when a white nationalist protester drove his car into a crowd. And this is a first in a series of relatively recent incidents in the United States that have led to violence at protests. In May and June of 2020, after the killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police member of the police department, and it was actually filmed, and people saw live across our country and I think around the world. There were protests that turned violent. There were 8,700 protests. This is based on data collected from the 70 largest police departments in the United States. 8,700 protests, and of those, 574 were declared riots because of the violence that was found on those days. A number of members of the police, as well as protesters and bystanders, were injured, and there was enormous property lost in the course of the protest. And then, most recently, these images from January 6th of 2021, when supporters of former President Trump tried to say that the results of the election were not valid. And this looks like a relatively peaceful photo, that people are protesting the outcome of the election. But when we go a little further and we look at the way this then played out, it was very, very different. There were 150 police officers injured on that day. This man here is spraying bear spray, which is used to neutralize grizzly bears in Alaska and Canada, and was using them on the police, who were doing their job defending the US Capitol against a intrusion that has since led to over 500 arrests of violent protesters on that day. So I think the important point to take away is that there are the occurrence of extremist violence. It takes different forms, but it's an issue that we are dealing with around the globe, and understanding it, and then understanding the means to promote community resilience and to stand up to the violence and eventually to prevent the violence. That becomes an important issue for all of our societies around the world. And so I want to talk to three different points, three ways to think about this framework for understanding extremism and promoting resilience. And the first of these is to consider the whole range of social science research methods. And I think we have a diverse group here of participants in the conference. And within the social sciences, we know there are different methods that are applied. There are quantitative methods. Often these are often surveys of people about extremism, or surveys of participants in violence. Also, quantitative methods can be the analysis of administrative data related to events where people were hurt, injured, and just as the numbers we looked at about the 8,700 protests in the months of May and June around the Black Lives Matter movement. So that's one approach, that you can use quantitative methods. You can also use qualitative methods. And here we originally think of the analysis of interviews or focus groups about extremism or resilience. But I want to emphasize that these qualitative methods can go much further, that there are, for example, you can do content analysis of different media and the way that they cover events of terrorism, events of violent protests. And those, they can be, mainstream media accounts, what we see in our newspapers, on electronic media, but also social media. to really understand how people are perceiving the events that are happening and understanding their origins and what should be done about them. And then I think also a third method that's important is ethnography. Here, sort of participant observation, going into the crowd. It's not necessarily the safest thing to do, but it's a way to get a sense of the emotions and the feelings, and whether it's in a riot or actually sort of infiltrating different groups. This is done by social science researchers as well as journalists to try to really get a sense of what people are thinking as they promote and even commit violence. And this ethnographic methods, those can also include the collection of artifacts. After the Great Recession in the US in 2008, 2009, there was something called the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was a resistance movement against the power of large banks and corporate America. And there were basically tent cities set up in large urban areas, including Washington, DC. And I had a couple of students who went and sort of went into the tent cities and talked to the individuals there, trying to understand, their motivations. These were, for the most part, peaceful demonstrations. But then also what they did is collect materials, posters, brochures. They took pictures of groups of people to try to then sort of add a richness that we don't necessarily get with quantitative or even qualitative methods. And then the fourth method I think really deserves some attention, is a quantitative, or it's a comparative and historical approach. And here I've put in a reference for you to what I think is a very valuable technique, and that is called QCA, or Qualitative Comparative Analysis. And this is a type of approach to the social sciences that's very useful when we have a relatively limited number of cases, whether it's countries or urban areas or protests. And in those cases, which are different from, say, survey research, where when I worked with the Department of Public Administration several years ago, and we did a survey of the residents of Karachi, we had many cases, close to 12,000, and a relatively small number of variables. And QCA is a method that's used when our number of cases is relatively small, but we have a richness of data, a large number of variables. And this also leads me to think and emphasize the importance of a comparative approach. Whether it's different provinces within Pakistan, or what I would encourage between different countries, between the US and Pakistan and other nations, is that what we get with a comparative approach is variation. And variation both in our independent variables and our dependent variables, in kind of the causes of extremism, as well as the causes of extremism and resilience. And those can be characteristics that vary from place to place. And then also with the outcomes, whether or not violence happens, whether or not resilience happens. And what we need to think about there is, if we're really considering our work to be social science, then we need variation. Without variation, we can do excellent descriptive work. It can be as good or even better than a well done piece of journalism, where stories are told and told in a coherent way. But once we try to say that we're doing social science, what we want to be able to do is think about at least correlation, and without variation, without changes in your dependent and independent variables, then you're not going to be able to think about correlation or even causation. And this is why a comparative approach can be so valuable, because you can maximize the degree of variation, which is going to give you greater explanatory power. And a second point that is worth considering is that we should attend to both the agency and structural elements of extremism and resilience. And here what I mean is to think about individuals as agents or groups as agents that either participate in or limit violence, participate in resilience or resist resilience at the individual level. But given my training as a sociologist, I think it's also very important that we think about the structural elements. What are the pieces of context in one nation compared to another nation that constrains and influences the way individuals act? And here, this is again sort of my argument for the value of comparative research, is that you get greater variation, particularly at the structural level, where you can begin to see differences in institutions and differences in culture that may not be found or may not be as great within a single context. The other point that I want to emphasize is that we should also pay attention to selection bias. And this is something that, in the social sciences, we have neglected for far too long. And the selection bias has to do with the cases that we study. And when we think about, for example, violent extremism, we tend to look at when things go bad, when things happen that are violent. And it's just as important to consider the non-events, to think about, this is a situation where we could have seen extreme violence, but we didn't. So what were the things that inoculated the situation, that kept violence from happening? And I think the best example of a selection bias and the importance of studying it is this article listed here by Howard Weiner. The title is very funny, Eelworms, Bullet Holes, and Geraldine Ferraro. I won't go into all the details about the title, but they're different examples of what he's talking about. And the one that I think makes his argument most clear is the bullet holes argument. And this was in during World War II. And World War II was the first time that there was aerial warfare, where air forces came to play a role in conflict. And the military said, we have a lot of planes that are going into combat, and they go into combat and don't come back because they get shot down. And so what the Army started to do was they looked at the planes, when they came back and they had bullet holes in them. What they did is they said, there's danger out there. Let's put extra armor on the airplanes, and we'll put the armor where there are bullet holes. And then they put the armor on, they sent the planes out, and there was absolutely no impact, that they were still having the same losses in the number of airplanes and pilots. And at that point, there was a statistician who walked in and said, we've got to think about selection bias, that there are planes not coming back. And where we have to put the armor is not where there are bullet holes, but where there are no bullet holes, because those are the bullets that destroyed airplanes and lost lives. Now, this is a good way to think about the non-event. Think about, how the people we're able to talk to are very different than the people we can't talk to. Then that the cases where we can study a riot or protest or act of terrorism. Those are important, but we also have to consider those cases where the riot, the terror, act of terror, the extremist protest didn't happen, to be able to say what inhibited that, what kept it from happening, because that's what we need to promote and to understand. Or if we're thinking about resilience and we find a community that's not resilient, let's try to understand why they were not resilient, because I think that's the way that we can really get a full picture, that we have variation, not only in our independent variables, but in our dependent variables. So I think I will, I know we're running a little late, so I think I'm going to stop there, except for one sort of concluding remark, which is, the value of events like this, where you're promoting international social science. This is one thing I feel very strongly about, is the idea of social science diplomacy, where we're seeing that the not only by using research from different contexts can we better understand the processes related to extremism and to resilience. It's also a way to bring together people to lead to common understanding, to build a basis for trust, and then also the recognition of common humanity that I think, it may begin within the sort of relatively small closed community of social scientists, but it's a chance to build that out, to then when you go home and talk to your friends, when you talk to colleagues in departments who are not social scientists, or to your family, that you say and are able to say, as I can, about when I talk to my friends and family and colleagues about Pakistan, that I can say, they have the same issues and concerns. The violence that we have faced is, that the Pakistani society has also faced these acts of terrorism within their country. And this then begins to build the basis for greater understanding and trust, which is really what is needed to limit extremist violence and develop the basis for resilience in our communities. So I think I will stop there. And if there's time, I'll take some questions, or people can pass them along to me by email.
Thank you, Dr. Witt, for your presentation. And what the idea of promoting international social sciences, and especially the promotion of social sciences diplomacy for community resilience. I think it's a very fantastic idea. And as you rightly pointed out, that there is a social sciences community is very small. So we can think of, and this would, create new avenues of thought for all of us. And I must also consider that our students who have joined us, they also learned a lot, particularly the information which we have provided related to the importance of comparative study and research approach in social sciences. And for I think there is no question so far, so we can, welcome the questions in the chat box later on, or they can directly email you. So, or maybe if you are with us tomorrow, they may put up their questions tomorrow as well.
Very good.
So with this, yeah. Oh, okay, there is one question, I think. No. Is there? Dr. Witt, there is one question. Okay. A counterfactual question. Had capital siege continued for 6 January onward, uh, the state would have erupted into a civil war.
It is a possibility. I think there were, this was a real shock to the United States. To see that level of violence, at the Capitol, at this symbol. I live right outside of Washington, D.C., and, that the images really were shocking, to places where we were able to sort of freely walk and go into, the U.S. Capitol is wide open, or was wide open to the public. And where people, unlike the violent protesters, citizens could walk in. You actually had access. You went through a metal detector like at the airport, but then you had access to members of Congress and to senators, and could go into their office and talk to them. And I think this was, in some ways, the greatest insult to mainstream America, that they recognized that this sort of openness was challenged by these protesters. And, there were very strong feelings. There have been a number of the Capitol Police Force who were there protecting the Capitol, who have been very outspoken about the protesters. And so you do have strong groups on both sides of the issue, that do have the potential to escalate the violence. I think there has been enough sort of calming down, but it always lurks sort of under the surface, and things break out. And this gets a little bit to what I was talking about. When does violence not happen? There was a good point about a counterfactual question. Why did that not lead to civil war? And, at least into greater unrest. And there are not only things like the contested election, or at least from supporters of former President Trump who contested, but other issues right now in the United States that are kind of below the surface, but could bubble up at any time. Things like racial injustice, the role of the police in society, that there is around the fringes of COVID-19. There are some people who are very, very strongly anti-vaccination, and that they have protested, and at times those have gotten a little bit ugly. And then I think the last issue to think about is issues related to abortion and pro-life and pro-choice. And there are people who are quite passionate one way or the other. And, because of the change in the composition of the Supreme Court in the United States, this is going to be an issue that will be highly contested in the months and years to come. And that also has the potential to really divide the country. And on this issue, there have been in the past, there have been bombings, there have been acts of terror against abortion clinics, against opponents of abortion. And, those, unless we can begin to build this level of resilience and trust, those we always have the potential to erupt into something very, very ugly.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dr. Witt. And with this, we have reached the end of today's session. And I'm grateful to Fayaz Saab, Sameem Fatma, Tariq Parvez Saab, and Dr. James Witt for their comprehensive analysis and presentations. So tomorrow we are meeting at 10:45 and we'll begin the session at 11 sharp. So see you tomorrow. Thanks a lot.